webcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on our webinar on practical strategies for emergency online instruction. My name is Stacy Young, and I am the Associate Dean of Faculty at VHS Learning. And I will be taking you through the presentation today with the support of a colleague, John Englander, who is the Associate Dean of Humanities here. And my primary role at VHS Learning is to train and support faculty in online instruction. And John and I will work together to support teachers in providing the best learning experiences possible for their students. John, I'm sorry, would you like to say hello?
Hi, I just wanted to say hi. I'm so happy everyone can join us today and hope everyone is safe and well.
Thanks, John. And so you'll be hearing John jump in occasionally. He may have something to add to one of the strategies I'm sharing with you, and he also will be fielding questions from the chat. So you'll hear a little bit more about the chat in a moment. We'll have a Q&A at the end, and he'll be gathering questions as we go along. So the purpose of today's webinar is to share best practices in online instruction that can be implemented into your practice immediately. While VHS Learning follows a very specific model of online teaching and learning, we understand the strategies that are most beneficial to teachers and students and have synthesized the ones that are applicable to any online setting, regardless of the model. So most of these strategies will probably be somewhat familiar to you, since best practices in online learning are mostly variations of best practices in face-to-face instruction. And we'll shine a light on the unique characteristics of online learning with a specific focus on emergency instruction. Our hope is that you will be able to take the strategies you've learned here today and apply them to your practice as soon as you log into your online course. And I just want to share a little bit of background about VHS Learning so you can understand who we are and why we are uniquely positioned to speak about online instruction. So VHS Learning is a nonprofit school course provider, which means that we partner with schools all around the world to give students access to rigorous online courses that satisfy high school graduation requirements. We have middle school courses as well. And VHS Learning has been leading the charge for quality in online education since our inception in 1996. We were the first in the nation to use the internet to connect students from around the country to subject matter experts and removed barriers of access to quality education in that way. We're also an example of a successful grant. We were originally funded by the US Department of Education, and now we are a self-sustaining nonprofit organization. We've also been involved in the national discussion of teaching and learning since we began in 1996. We co-authored the standards for online learning that were used nationally. And last year, John and I actually worked with partner organizations, Quality Matters and VLLA, to revise these standards. And they are known as the National Standards for Quality Online Learning, that NSQ in the middle. And we're also accredited by Middle States Association Commission on Elementary and Secondary Schools and Advanced Ed, which is now known as Cognia. And unlike many online providers, we are approved for NCAA credit due to the pacing and rigor of our courses. Last year, we had around 18,000 enrollments from 30 states and 30 countries with hundreds of teachers who come to us through the partner schools and also through as independent contractors. And we train all of our teachers through a 4-week graduate level course called Online Teaching Methodologies, which is an asynchronous paced cohort-based training model. I'll talk about those terms in a minute. It's modeled after our student courses. So most people take OTM to train to teach with us, but we also have folks who join us as a professional development opportunity. Basically, we have today taken the proven strategies from our teachers from OTM and just in their instruction to distill them into this lens of emergency online instruction to share with you. And a quick review of our agenda. We already covered the introductions and overview. Next, we will review various online learning approaches that you may be using or considering. We'll continue with strategies to make learning within an online environment accessible to all students. Then discuss meeting the needs of learners with some high-level strategies for making accommodations based on IEP and 504 plans, as well as accommodations for students who are not on ed plans that experience some extenuating circumstances. And we will end the presentation with a discussion of how to best get students to show you what they know in measuring student progress. We'll wrap up with a Q&A section. So if you can take just a moment right now on the little bar that's probably floating on your screen, there's a chat feature at the bottom. And you can, at any time during the presentation, you can pop a question in there, and John will be gathering those, and we will read through those for some Q&A at the end. And certainly if you have more questions after we wrap up, you can continue to ask them. All right, so before we jump into the actual strategies for effective online instruction, I want to review some models of course delivery in the online setting. So I'm assuming that most cases, if you've been teaching in a brick and mortar school, you've probably transitioned to maybe teaching the students that were previously in your course already. So these are probably kids you already knew. I'm just going to go over two areas of online instruction that tend to differ greatly from the traditional in-person course. The first one is the timing. So when the learning happens. And then the other one is the pacing. They're slightly different. Pacing is the speed at which the learning happens. So online course delivery, there's a continuum of ways that we can address timing. On the left, you'll see asynchronous learning is the type of learning that happens when teachers and students don't have a scheduled time to meet together. So students and teachers both will log in as their schedules allow and complete work. And the work may have deadlines, but the main idea is that you're not meeting at the same time with your students necessarily. If you go to the other end of the spectrum, you'll see synchronous learning. And this is when you have scheduled meeting time and all participants show up online at that time. That's what happens in a face-to-face environment. We are synchronously together, meeting in the same time and the same place. In online learning, you could have your students come together and run a class similarly to how you would have run it face-to-face, just you're not in the same space. You're in maybe the same virtual space. And often what we see is a blended approach where there's some kind of asynchronous learning structure with scheduled time for teachers to meet with students, either one-on-one or as a group. And pacing is another aspect of online course delivery. So this is the other piece that we're going to just focus on for our purposes today. In a traditional face-to-face model, students are often in that lockstep, the box on the left, with their classmates in pacing. This is an approach that's relatively easily adaptable to the online model. At the other end of the spectrum are self-paced models, and a lot of those include a lot of auto-graded work. Computer analytics will decide what the student is going to learn next, how they might approach it. So teachers can be involved in a self-paced model, but it would be pretty intensive for a teacher of dozens and dozens of students to try to keep up with everybody's schedule. So usually there's a space in the middle that might work better for everyone, and that's the flexibly paced model, particularly in this current setting where students have different challenges that we may not know about. The flexibility that we can offer make it look different from person to person, from student to student, but the flexibility we can offer can allow for some kind of structure that keeps them going along at a certain pace without having everybody sitting in their own sort of pathway. And for example, the VHS Learning model has students who are asynchronously coming in, and they are working on the same work as their peers at a slightly different pace. They can complete the work when they want, but they do have weekly deadlines to keep them on pace. So The lockstep or flexibly paced models allow for asynchronous or synchronous discussion or group work. But if you were to move to the self-paced model, you wouldn't be able to offer that. So regardless of the timing or the pacing that you're using, the following strategy should be applicable to your instructional practice. And before we jump into the strategies, this is probably one of the big aspects of online instruction and face-to-face instruction and just living in the world with other people. Communication is such an important aspect of how we work with people and how we get things done. It's really the foundation of teaching and learning in the best of circumstances. And as we find ourselves all adapting to procedures put in place as a response to the current pandemic, effective communication is arguably the most essential tool that we can use to minimize the disruption and continue to make progress in the classroom. So as we go through the following strategies, I want you to think about ways that you can communicate with the students and other stakeholders, and think about how you can incorporate the following strategies. What role does communication play in that for you? You'll also need to consider the technology you have available to you. If possible, providing students with opportunities to see your face and hear your voice with the live audio and video will help them feel more connected with you. And you can record the sessions if you're not meeting synchronously with students. And if you don't have video capabilities, you can always record audio messages. And if neither of those is an option, writing is really the tool that you'll need to lean on. Ideally, you're using some kind of blend of all of these, but certainly you know what limitations you have based on your technology and your school's expectations. This chart just sort of illustrates that you could have the asynchronous model, you could have asynchronous with office hours or synchronous and have regular communication with your students. All right, so moving into the first area, we're going to talk about making learning accessible for all students. Accessibility is something that is familiar to teachers, and many strategies you use in your face-to-face classroom are easily adaptable to the online environment. The Universal Design for Learning Guidelines, UDL, which you may be familiar with, these guidelines provide a nice little roadmap for developing online instruction. And particularly, I think they're valuable in an emergency scenario because you can sort of laser focus on pieces of UDL practice to try to make the curriculum more accessible to your students. And I do want to say accessibility is one of those words that has multiple meanings in this modern day. So I am talking about helping students to access material, helping them understand and engage with the work that they're supposed to do. This is not about access to technology and the internet, although that also is obviously important and crucial to being able to succeed in online learning, but this is about the teacher's role in instructionally. So making learning accessible refers to how we can eliminate barriers so students can understand both the content and what they're being asked to do to show their understanding. Universal Design for Learning guidelines have been laid out by CAST, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to expanding learning opportunities through UDL, and their website has some really great resources. So for our purposes, I'm going to walk through CAST's UDL guidelines as they apply to online instruction. And I've included this graphic, the cartoon on the side. I think universal design originally was about designing buildings to make them universally accessible to people regardless of ability. So ramps are a really good example of universal design, including ramps in buildings so that someone in a wheelchair can always get up the ramp and get into the building. And the great thing is everyone can use the ramp. So this cartoon sort of illustrates, we've got somebody shoveling the steps, which would open things up for some of the kids, but not all of the kids. So putting that mindset in place, how can I make the learning accessible for all of the kids and not just some of the kids? That's what I'm hoping we can do. So the first piece of this model is providing multiple means of engagement, and that's how we stimulate students' interest and motivation for learning. And this graphic is organized as a hierarchy. So if you look at the base, that's the foundation upon which all these other strategies can build. If you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that lowest level is about survival, it's food, water, oxygen, shelter. It's about being able to keep your body safe so that you can just survive. And I would say that communication is the underpinning of all of these other pieces. So, and I also will mention this, these are all highly applicable to the face-to-face classroom. And it's really about how we communicate, which we've discovered. And then we'll drill down on these other ones as well as it applies to the online emergency learning situation. So effective communication certainly will help students and teachers stay connected and help students be engaged. And moving up a little bit, the next level is purpose. And that refers to having a clear reason for including the content and lessons you are delivering to students. It needs to be clear to students so they will see a reason to fully engage. And you've likely been working on some kind of realignment of your curriculum. If you've been asked to switch your curriculum to an online model, you've probably been asked to prioritize and think what are the most important pieces that kids need to be able to complete this school year. So as you're doing that, I would ask you to consider how the lessons are aligned to the learning standards and how well the material is presented to the kids in a way that is engaging and interesting in the online format. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the upcoming slides. But we want it to be very interesting. We all know about engagement in the classroom and how challenging it can be. There's another layer of challenge with the online classroom. So being crystal clear about the purpose, communicating that to students, and making it really engaging. And then moving up a little bit, feedback is another essential aspect of student engagement. So online, the challenges of providing feedback include making sure the students understand where they got it right and where they need to improve, as well as how to make those improvements. Again, true in the face-to-face classroom, but by providing substantive, instructive feedback to students, we can allow them to learn what they're doing right and leverage those strengths to progress and improve in areas that they're having challenges. So anytime that you can point to a specific strategy the student got right previously, you can help them apply the knowledge or skills to a new situation. So you can say, you know, you were really on the right track in this first part, I just need you to dig in more deeply. Or you could give an example of something they previously had completed. You could say, last week you showed great understanding in this lab report, and I want you to apply the same type of questioning that you used there with this new content. And of course, you'll need to be really specific about where it was that they were showing this understanding or the skill, but making sure that they really have clear direction from you about what they're doing right and what they need to improve on is critical. And this is where also providing that feedback in writing or maybe recording your voice if you have the technology that allows that can be really helpful too. Also, formative feedback. Yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you know, in this online setting, and especially in sort of an asynchronous online setting, the piece around the teacher needing to be attentive to communication and checking in as often as possible to see, because so often feedback does have a timing piece to it, and students can get frustrated if they're asking for feedback and don't get it in a timely fashion. So, you know, keep that in mind if you're dealing with students in an asynchronous manner, just to prioritize checking to make sure there aren't questions and comments that you need to respond to.
Thanks, John. That is a good point. The timing is really important. And I would also say, I think that comes up a lot with the formative assessment when you think about, or not necessarily even formative, but informal assessments. You're going to lose the interaction that you would have in the hallway or at the beginning or end of class. So those things will look different as well. And that's where you can use other communication strategies to make sure you're having a lot of touch points with the kids. So if you have the basics of communication, purpose, and feedback, again, if we're thinking about this as the hierarchy of needs, these are the things you need to have most solidly. I would say those are the highest priority of the pyramid. And then you can think about where students have choice in their learning. This could be giving them a choice in the topics to study in a unit or how they present their materials. It may not always be possible, which is true in the face-to-face environment as well, but when you can inject some choice, their engagement level will go up. It's nurturing that ownership that they'll have in their learning that they might not otherwise have an entry point for. So you could just look at your curriculum and imagine ways that students could deviate a little bit. Is there a way to infuse their personal interests more that won't disrupt the learning or won't take away from meeting the learning goals? And then finally, student reflection could arguably appear much earlier in the pyramid structure, but I would definitely recommend using this for students who seem to be struggling to stay engaged online. If you ask a student to reflect on where they're being successful, as well as what obstacles they are seeing, you will learn a lot about them, and they will be able to show you where they need the most support. So we might know those students one way in a classroom, but we don't know them yet as online learners so much. So we want to make sure that we understand what is happening for them and support them fully. So moving on to multiple means of representation, this refers to presenting information and content in multiple ways to increase students' ability to engage with materials and learn. So much of this is about format and is highly applicable to online learning. Excuse me, sorry. The content is represented both in pages you design and in materials that are linked. So online, you'll create some pages where students show up with instruction, and then you will also probably have links to external sources. And we can't really control the external sources. So as you're choosing those for students, you want to make sure that you're keeping the UDL formatting in mind. So that includes critical content on the side. You want your text to be clear and easy to read. So make sure if you're playing around a little bit with fonts and colors and size, it's not a distraction, and keep in mind that you might see something clearly that somebody else doesn't. So really tending to the visual elements so that everybody can access the material. Audio, you want to consider the clarity of the audio, the volume, and the rate of speech, and also include a transcription if possible. The audio quality refers to certainly if you're making something, but a lot of times you might find something online and the quality may not be great. The format, you want it to be uncluttered, easy to read for students. And then on assignments themselves, please make sure the instructions are clear, using vocabulary and terminology that is straightforward and well-defined. I think I was a former English teacher, and I remember feeling when I taught high school English that if they should know this word because they were in 11th grade, so I can put it in the instructions. And I've kind of rethought that over the years and realized they're not being assessed on their ability to read the instructions. I need to really eliminate all obstacles to them understanding what they need to do. So simplifying language when possible and letting them have a way to understand what the vocabulary is. And providing alternative content delivery methods. So there are a lot of great open source materials out there. They're reading an audio book, or if they're reading a book, you could maybe find an audio version. If there's a concept that you've shared one way, you might be able to find another way for them to see that, online somewhere. I'm going to skip ahead now to multiple means of expression. And this is the way students express themselves around what they've learned. Writing is often a default measure that we use in face-to-face classes and online. It's probably the easiest structurally to get to turn in and look at, but it's really not always playing to a student's strength. So to increase student engagement, you want to make sure you give them an opportunity to show what they know in multiple ways. And I'm not going to read these to you, you can see them, but the left side is about giving them options of how they will show that the way they've learned something. And the right side is more about the actual format. So they could do a book report, for example. It could be a written paper or an oral presentation or some kind of recorded performance. So those two columns might blend together a little bit. You might pick and choose a little bit how you do it. Again, these are great strategies for the face-to-face classroom, but because we're really trying to elevate the students' ability to access the material and show what they know, it feels more important a lot of times in the online environment. So we're going to transition now to accommodating for students. And as teachers, you're familiar with formal accommodations, and these are the accommodations that we make for students with IEP and 504 plans. These are usually legally binding documents, and they're usually longer term, although a 504 plan could be temporary. I think they are temporary in nature. The IEPs have regular reviews. But as you're thinking about putting these accommodations into practice online, there are some that are well documented, and then there are some that maybe are a little more amorphous. So the well documented ones, we can give you some tips on, and then we can give you some general ideas for the other side, the informal accommodations, which is usually around extenuating circumstances. This could be an extended illness, a death in the family, a natural disaster. Certainly, we are dealing with a pandemic right now, and our students are responding to something that there's no precedent for, as we all are, but our students may be really struggling. So I would say be generous with your accommodations of students, even if they were really high-powered kids and successful in the classroom when they were in front of you. Don't assume we know what's going on, and we can think about ways to accommodate them in the short term that can help them be successful. So let's look at a few specific accommodations. And these are some general accommodations that we might see regularly in an IEP or 504 plan, or that we may use to respond to a specific student need or extenuating circumstance. These are accommodations that translate relatively easily to the online classroom. Extended time is one that may actually be built into the model. You've gone from meeting with students for 52 minutes every day for 5 days a week to now you have assignments that are due every Thursday. They suddenly may have some extended time built in. So you'll want to think about what that means for your online learner. Work reduction, breaking tasks into manageable steps, grammar penalties, and use of calculator. Those are all just don't require an explanation, really. That's what you've been doing in the classroom. The ones that maybe have a little bit of a difference are if there's an accommodation for preferential seating, it's not really applicable to the online classroom. However, this might be a really good opportunity to ask a student or think for yourself, why was this student using preferential seating, excuse me, and then have a conversation with the student or the family. So what does that mean for you in your home now? Well, you're learning from home. Is there a space that will best suit you for learning, for being ready to learn? So there might be a place that they sit, there might be some other accommodation that you just chat with them about to make sure that they're getting the support they need there. Frequent check-ins can still happen. They tend to happen with messages or scheduling virtual time to check in on student progress. If there is a parent at home or guardian who is able to support this, you might touch base with that person to see what that looks like at home as well. And redirection is another one that we see sometimes as an accommodation, redirecting the student, making sure they're focused and on task. And again, that might require support from home. It might be good to have a conversation with a student about how can we make sure you still get what you need from that accommodation now that you're at home. And so generally with accommodations, I would say, yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to pipe in one point on accommodations, and
Yeah.
I think a lot of people think that it's not that kids who need accommodations and online learning is not a good fit, and that's not the case at all. But it does mean some of these extra supports and thoughtfulness and considerations that Stacy's bringing up. I know we've worked with a lot of students who have learning challenges, and it can work incredibly well. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, it's interesting because some students who struggle in the face-to-face classroom thrive in the online classroom and vice versa. So it's really about knowing your own kids well and knowing what they need to be successful and being creative. You know, some of this, I will say, we're not special education experts, but we do have a lot of experience working with kids who have special needs, and we've worked out some, you know, some good options for these kids. And in part, that actually leads me nicely into this slide, because these are the questions that we ask when we have students come to us, and we don't know these students at all usually, but we would ask, what is the purpose of an accommodation? So if there's an accommodation that there's not an easy one-to-one way to implement in the online classroom, we'd look at these, we would look at the accommodation and say, what's the purpose? And then what does it look like in the face-to-face classroom? And what might it look like in the online classroom? And as we think through that, the next question is, has this solution met the purpose of the accommodation? So if it's, you know, if you have a student who needs preferential seating because they are constantly being sociable with friends, at home they might actually have better success sitting at their own desk because there just aren't as many distractions with peers around. But that's one example. But really asking these questions for any of the accommodations, even the ones that seem to smoothly fit the online model. Ed plans are not written for online classrooms typically, so we need to be critical thinkers and be creative and be collaborative with the students and the families to make sure that they're getting their needs met.
Stacy, can I ask a question because it's timely, and
Yep.
Amber Anderson, who's online, posted this question, and I thought maybe you would have thoughts on it. The question is, how often do you feel the special ed teacher should be checking in on their students?
Well, that is kind of tough. I was actually speaking with a friend who is a special ed teacher, and hearing some of her challenges about trying to keep up with her students and trying to manage schedules. I think I would start with the ed plan and use the recommendations there as a starting point, but taking into consideration that people, even though most of us don't have a lot going on outside of our work and school because of the nature of how things are right now, there are some other things going on in people's lives. You know, a special ed teacher could have many children at home, as many teachers do, and it might be hard to manage a caseload in that environment. I mean, I think depending on the student, I would say that's a really good conversation to have with the parent and the special ed teacher and maybe school administration, especially if you think a student is particularly struggling in the online environment, or if you're struggling to come up with appropriate accommodations for the student. It sort of depends, but I appreciate that dilemma for sure. All right, we just have a couple of slides left, and then we'll move fully into questions, but please do interrupt John if there's something that's more timely. Finally, we're just going to talk pretty briefly about how do we know that students are getting it, basically. How do we know that what they know? And again, this isn't unique to online learning, but there is an added layer of challenge in the online classroom because you're not sharing space with students. So on the left side of this column, you see these are accessible online strategies. I mean, I'm using the word accessible here again. I probably should use a different word, but what I mean by that is you are able as a teacher to pretty easily transition a quiz from paper to online. Relatively easy. It probably is a little of a hassle, but easier than a lot of other kinds of assignments. So, quizzes, tests, assignments, and homework projects, discussions, those are all really familiar and they all translate pretty well to the online classroom. And you can read those and see how students are doing, or view or listen, however the student is sharing what they know. Some obstacles to think about are, and things that we don't want to take for granted. The informal discussions and check-ins really are a way that we assess student understanding sometimes. And we don't really have the luxury of sharing time and space right now to have a quick conversation. Another one is clarification on work turned in the moment when a student turns something in, and you catch a little piece of that assignment and say, oh, that's not clear, and you have that quick conversation. You're like, oh yeah, he knows what he's talking about. Good. You know, you can eliminate some of those really small but important ambiguities sometimes in that quick conversation. And those can still happen. They just need to happen in either a scheduled meeting or in some kind of communication between you and the student. And the bottom three are the ones that I think are really tricky. When you think instructionally about standing in front of your students and going over the materials, and you're always watching. It's not scientific, but I think it's kind of a teacher's superpower to be able to look at the group and see who's getting it and who's not by their body language, facial expressions, and tone as you interact with them. So they might not come out and say, I don't understand this, but you can usually tell. If you're in tune with your students, you can usually tell if they're getting it or not. So those pieces, I don't want to take for granted that how much information we as teachers get from students. And also, when we think about tools for measuring understanding, I do want to go back to the idea from the UDL slide that it's important for students to have multiple ways to interact with the material, as well as multiple ways for them to express their understanding of the material. And the last slide I have is, I just have a couple more thoughts on this, and really create effective assessments. And by assessments, I mean those formative assessments, informal, formal, summative, all of those. Anytime you're trying to figure out what a student knows and understands, it's critical to have clear learning targets. We've already talked about this, but scaling back, that now is the time to really say, what are the most essential things for students to know and be able to do? If you remember, or if you've been exposed to, Grant Wiggins describes this as, this is essential to know, important to know, and nice to know. And the nice to know is like the stuff that you can kind of let go of, and maybe a few important to know pieces can be let go of. Right now, it's really what is essential to know. And after you get your feet under you and your kids get their feet under them, you can start adding some of those more supplemental, less essential pieces to the learning that sort of make the classroom experience so rich. But for now, it's like, what's the least they need to do? How can we help them get through this particular time? And related to that is engagement. So making that really relevant to them and making sure that they understand the purpose so that they can interact and enjoy some interesting and motivating content. And the last piece is complexity. So when you're thinking about measuring what a student knows and you're designing actual material, more formal material, you can get a lot of bang for your buck when you ask really rich questions or problems for students to grapple with so that they can show their higher order thinking. You certainly need to know that they understand the basics, but you also want to adopt a less is more approach and ask them complex questions. And that will help you get a better snapshot of how in depth they understand the material without necessarily increasing their workload too much. And that's a pretty dense, the idea of complexity is a pretty dense one, but ultimately it's about really making the most of every teaching and learning moment you have, because in the context of an emergency, we don't have a lot of wiggle room. We need to be laser focused on what we want students to do and how they want us to show what they know. And we want to clear away any non-essentials so that they can really prioritize what the most important learning is. So I'm going to pause there and thank you for listening. I know we went a little bit over, but we can hang it. So So, John, are there more questions for us? Oh, I think somebody's unmuted.
I think someone's. Okay. There was a question about, let's see. So a big challenge for schools in Rhode Island is how to make answers to assessments non-Googleable, which is a great question. It is a huge issue in online learning, and some of the things that we suggest and do, some of the practices that we try, are, first of all, if possible, to have the types of prompts and questions that are used force students to think deeply and have unique responses to questions. We also use a tool called Turnitin, which is built into our learning management system, which is a plagiarism detection tool. It's very hard if you don't have a tool like that to know if students are doing it. So in this sort of emergency way where a lot of students are doing this for the first time, I would go back to communication and sort of the contracting, the social contracting that you have done in your face-to-face classrooms, and try to carry that over and talk to students about the importance of entering the learning environment with integrity and not and trying to do the work themselves. And if you have access to plagiarism detection tools, which a lot of people do, that's very helpful. But it is, there are certain software and applications out there that do help sort of create an environment in your browser where you can't go to Google and things, but that's a separate client that needs to be downloaded, so it's not used all that much. But so those are some ideas there.
I would also say, John, it doesn't have to be super complicated. One of my favorite questions to ask students, and I think it applies to so many units study or whatever you're trying to get at, is what would happen if? And it's a little bit higher order thinking because you're replacing a variable. What would happen if you could do a story? You could do it in science. You could do it in what would have happened if? And then all of a sudden the students are really trying to make connections about, what would happen if this, and then why do you think so? It's really hard to Google that question. So unless it's like a pretty common question asked about a certain historical event or something like that, it would be a nice question to ask, I think.
Yeah, and even one step further with that, if you're, as a teacher, if you're thinking about it from this sort of filter of how can I ask questions that are really going to make them think deeply and get unique prompts, that's actually just plain good pedagogy, and that's a good technique to use. Jennifer Thompson, who's one of our site coordinators, she had a comment she wanted to make, which I think is great, and I just wanted to read it if you haven't read it. She says, I do an informal discussion and check-in with each VHS student twice a week. I then turnkey that information to the teacher. It really works, especially with students with accommodations taking online coursework. And I just want to say that's fantastic. If anything, in these times, more communication, the better. And if there are parents or site coordinators who are really putting in the effort to not only check in with the student on what they're doing and in a systematic way, but then communicate with the teacher on that, that is a huge important strategy. Let's see.
I want to say too, the site coordinator, if you're not within the VHS Learning family, a site coordinator is a liaison that sort of connects VHS Learning to, and the teacher to the school. So they're the person who would help with any academic challenges that students have who are coming to us. So I would say a nice proxy for that is thinking about a parent or trusted adult in the student's life as they're at home right now. Having a connection to somebody who is physically connected to the kid is a really valuable tool, or invaluable tool, as our friend Dorothy Maxwell says.
Correct. Stacey, there were a couple other questions, but I think I sort of responded in writing to them.
Okay, good. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we will be sending out a copy of this presentation to you in the coming days, so be on the lookout for that. And certainly if you want to get in touch with us, I'm not sure, is there an easy way for you to get in touch with us?
Okay, thank you too. Greetings from El Salvador.
Oh, wow, welcome.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Safe there.
I am a second grade teacher, English here,
Oh,
Wonderful.
but I work in Atlanta as a Spanish teacher.
well, that's exciting. Are you working from home now then?
Yeah, from home right now,
Yeah.
using Google Meet for
Yep.
second grade. I'm learning a lot, and I'm quite excited about your webinar. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us. I hope it was helpful for the second grade teachers as well.
Very good. I will share it with the rest of my colleagues. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
It means a lot to us that there are not just people in our sort of VHS Learning family, but people outside of it and around the world. We're all in this together, new uncharted territory. So thank you for that.
Thank you for taking the time. From Puerto Rico, we send our regards, and be safe and healthy.
You as well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. It's really great to have so many people on here from so many different places, and hopefully we've got thank you from Bolivia. We are hitting the Latin America circuit here. So thanks so much for joining us, and be on the lookout for more information from us.
Yeah, stay safe.